The evening sun was low when Daniel rode his horse down the dusty trail toward the river. The wind was soft, brushing across the dry grass, carrying the scent of mesquite and warm sand. He had been working all week at a small ranch outside the town, fixing fences and hauling hay. He wasn't much of a talker, and most folks said he liked silence more than company. That was true. The wide-open desert gave him peace. He was planning to rest by the river before heading home. His horse, a brown mare named Daisy, was thirsty after a long ride. When Daniel reached the shallow bend of the San Pedro River, he dismounted and loosened the reins so Daisy could drink. The sky glowed red and gold, and everything was quiet except the sound of flowing water and crickets. It was the kind of quiet that made him forget everything else, until he heard a sudden splash. At first he thought it was a fish or a rock slide. But then he heard it again, a faint cry, a soft voice calling for help. Daniel turned sharply and saw movement near the deeper part of the river. He ran toward it, boots sinking in wet sand. What he saw made his heart jump. A young girl was in the water, struggling to stay above the surface. Her long, dark hair floated around her, and her hands kept slipping as she tried to grab a rock. The river wasn't deep, but the current was strong. Without thinking, Daniel jumped into the water. The cold hit him fast, but he didn't care. He grabbed her arm and pulled her close. She was light but weak, her clothes soaked and heavy. He dragged her toward the shore, pushing against the current until they reached the dry bank. The girl coughed hard, gasping for air, her small frame shaking. Daniel helped her sit up and covered her with his jacket. She was about 15 or 16, with tanned skin and dark eyes that looked frightened but strong. Her dress was torn at the edge, and she wore a small beaded necklace that looked handmade. Daniel could tell she was Apache. He had seen their camps before, though he had never spoken to one of them. She didn't say much at first. Just looked at him, eyes wide, as if she didn't know if she should trust him. He smiled gently and said, "You're safe now." She didn't reply. Then in a soft voice she said a single word, "Nita." That was all. Her name. Daniel nodded and said, "I'm Daniel." He motioned toward his camp nearby. "Come on, you need to get warm." He made a small fire by the rocks and wrapped her in a blanket. She sat quietly, her knees pulled close, staring at the flames. He cooked a bit of beans and bread he had in his pack and offered it to her. She hesitated but took it slowly, eating like someone who hadn't eaten in days. The night grew cooler, and Daniel kept the fire going. He noticed she watched him closely, like she was studying every move he made. Once, when the wind blew hard, she flinched and glanced toward the dark river, as if afraid it might call her back. When the moon rose, Daniel spoke again, trying to keep things calm. "Tomorrow I'll take you to your people," he said softly. "You can tell me where your village is." She didn't answer. Her eyes met his, and there was something strange in them. Not fear exactly, but something deeper, something he couldn't explain. The firelight flickered over her face. Daniel looked away, unsure why he felt nervous. He was used to being alone. Helping someone was not new to him, but this was different. The girl had a way of sitting so still, so silent. It was almost like she could hear the ground breathe. He laid out his blanket a few feet away and told her to rest. She didn't move for a while, then slowly lay down near the fire. The night was long and quiet except for the sound of the river flowing nearby. Daniel didn't sleep much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment again, her small hand reaching out from the water. By morning, he woke up to find her standing near Daisy, touching the horse's mane gently. The horse didn't seem afraid, which surprised him. Daisy was shy around strangers, but she stood calm beside the girl. When Daniel got up, Nita looked at him and smiled slightly for the first time. It was a soft, short smile, but it changed the feeling around them. After they packed up, Daniel pointed north. "We'll head that way," he said. "Maybe I'll find your camp." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. They rode together slowly, Daniel leading the horse and Nita walking beside him. She didn't complain about the distance or the heat. Once in a while, she would stop to pick berries or herbs from the ground, then quietly hand them to him without a word. By midday, Daniel stopped by a ridge to rest. He offered her some water. She took a sip, then said, "You help me, I help you." It was the first full sentence she spoke. He didn't know what she meant, but he just nodded and said, "That's fair." When the sun started to fall, Daniel found a spot to camp again. He looked around the land. No sign of smoke, no sound of drums, nothing to show where her people might be. Tomorrow, he told himself, we'll keep searching. That night, as he sat by the fire, he noticed she was looking up at the stars, murmuring something in her language. It sounded like a song or prayer. Her voice was soft, but it filled the quiet air. When she finished, she turned toward him and said quietly, "River spirit angry." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked. She touched her necklace and said, "River take life. You stop it, now it watch." He didn't know what to say. He just smiled a little and replied, "You're safe now. The river can't hurt you." But her eyes didn't change. She looked back at the dark water beyond the firelight as if it was listening. In the morning, when Daniel woke, she was already awake, feeding the horse and packing his things neatly. It surprised him again. She acted as though she had been traveling with him for years. When he tried to lead her toward her home, she simply followed him in silence, never once trying to go her own way. For the next few days, he kept telling himself she would leave soon. Maybe she was just afraid to go back alone. Maybe she didn't know the way. But wherever he went, she went too. When he stopped to eat, she sat beside him. When he repaired a saddle, she handed him tools without being asked. When he rode into the nearby town for supplies, she waited outside patiently until he came back. People began to notice. Some gave them long looks, others whispered quietly. Daniel pretended not to hear. He was used to talk, used to being the quiet man folks didn't understand, but he could feel the stares following him everywhere now, and it made him uneasy. That night, after they returned to camp, he said softly, "You can go home now, Nita. You don't have to stay with me." She looked at him, then pointed to his chest and said, "You save me. I stay." Daniel didn't argue anymore. He didn't understand her reasons, but he didn't feel right sending her away. There was something peaceful about her presence, something steady. When she sat near the fire, it didn't feel lonely anymore. Still, deep inside, Daniel wondered what tied her to him so strongly. Was it gratitude, fear, or something he couldn't see? Every night, when he heard the river far away, he thought of her words. The river takes life. You stop it, now it watches. He didn't believe in spirits or old stories, but sometimes when the wind moved across the water, it almost sounded like a voice. And though he tried to tell himself she would leave one day, part of him already knew she wouldn't. Weeks passed, and Daniel still could not understand why Nita stayed by his side. He had tried to guide her toward the mountain trails where her people lived, but every time he turned his horse, she followed without question. She moved quietly, never asking for anything, never complaining about the heat or the long rides. It was as if she had decided that wherever he went, that was her place now. Daniel often wondered what she thought about all day. She hardly spoke. Sometimes she would hum a tune in her language, soft and low, while she gathered wood for the fire or washed clothes by the river. Other times she sat still for hours, watching the horizon like she was waiting for something only she could see. He had grown used to her company, though he didn't admit it out loud. His small camp felt less empty now. The mornings started with the smell of fresh coffee and wild herbs that she brewed in a small pot. At night, she would hand him small charms made from feathers and twigs, saying they were for protection. He didn't believe in such things, but he kept them anyway. One evening, as they camped near a canyon, Daniel noticed storm clouds building in the distance. The wind turned cold and thunder rolled far away. He looked up and said quietly, "We should find shelter before it rains." Nita nodded, but her face looked worried. She pointed toward the dark sky and whispered, "River spirit angry again." Daniel smiled a little, trying to ease her fear. "It's just a storm," he said gently. "Nothing more." But as night fell, the wind grew stronger and the rain came down hard. They found a small cave nearby and took shelter inside. The fire crackled faintly as rain echoed outside. While Daniel tried to dry their clothes near the flame, Nita sat across from him, her eyes half closed, whispering words he didn't understand. The sound of her voice mixed with the storm until he couldn't tell if it was prayer or song. When the thunder hit close, she reached out suddenly and touched his hand. He froze. Her hand was cold, but her eyes were calm. "It wants you," she said softly. Daniel looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared toward the mouth of the cave, where rain poured down like silver threads. River want balance, she said after a moment. It'd take one life. You stopped it. Now it waits. Daniel didn't know what to say. He had no patience for old beliefs, but the look on her face made him uneasy. He turned his eyes to the fire and said quietly, "You don't have to worry about me, Nita. I'll be fine." When morning came, the storm had passed. The desert smelled fresh and clean. They rode out again, and for a while everything seemed normal. But strange things began to happen after that. One afternoon, as Daniel led the horse across a dry creek, Daisy suddenly stopped and refused to move. Her ears twitched and she looked frightened. Daniel tried to pull her forward, but she backed away nervously. A second later, part of the old creek bed collapsed under his boot, revealing a deep hole filled with water. If he had taken one more step, he would have fallen in. Nita stood on the other side, watching silently. She said only one word, "See?" Another time, while Daniel was chopping wood, a snake slithered from the grass near his leg. Before he could move, Nita threw a stick and scared it away. When he turned toward her, she didn't smile or speak. She only looked at him with the same quiet eyes, like it was her duty to keep him safe. The small town nearby had started to talk. Some men said the Apache girl had bewitched him. Others said she was paying a life debt. Daniel didn't listen to any of them. He had grown tired of gossip long ago. Still, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something about her presence was beyond reason. One night, as they sat beside the fire, he finally asked, "Why do you stay with me, Nita? You've been safe for weeks. You could have gone home." She looked at the flames for a long time before speaking. "My home far," she said slowly. "You saved me. Now River can't touch you if I stay." Her words sounded strange, but there was honesty in her tone. Daniel didn't argue. He had seen enough strange moments lately to stop calling everything superstition. After that night, he didn't ask her to leave again. As spring came, the world around them softened. The hills turned green and wildflowers covered the desert floor. Daniel built a small cabin from old timber near a cluster of cottonwood trees. It wasn't much, just one room with a small porch, but it gave them shelter. Nita helped without needing to be told. She carried wood, cooked meals, and even mended his clothes. Life became quiet but peaceful. They rarely saw anyone. Sometimes traders passed by, but Daniel kept to himself. He liked the stillness. Nita, on the other hand, seemed to live between two worlds. Part of her belonged to the earth, part of her to something unseen. She often walked to the river alone, sitting by the water for hours. When she came back, she always looked thoughtful, almost sad. One afternoon, Daniel followed her without telling her. He stayed far enough away not to disturb her. She stood by the riverbank holding her necklace in both hands. The wind lifted her hair as she spoke in her own language. Though Daniel didn't understand the words, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Her voice carried a sadness he couldn't describe. When she turned and saw him, she didn't look angry. She only said, "It still watches, but now it knows you belong to me." Her words confused him. "What do you mean?" he asked softly. Nita smiled faintly and said, "It can't take you if I stay close. We are one now." He didn't know if she meant it as a promise or a warning. Still, he said nothing more. Years went by slowly. Their cabin became their whole world. Sometimes, when travelers passed through, they spoke of the quiet man and the Apache girl who never left each other's side. Some said she had saved his life more than once. Others said she kept him alive by speaking to the wind. As time passed, Daniel grew older. His hair turned gray and his hands became rough with age. Nita never seemed to change much. Her face stayed calm, her eyes bright, her movements graceful. She still watched over him the same way she had from the day he pulled her from the river. One morning, Daniel woke to find her gone. Her blanket was folded neatly beside the fire. He looked for her tracks and followed them toward the river. When he reached the bank, he found her necklace resting on a flat stone near the water. The river was calm that day, sunlight dancing across its surface. He waited all day, calling her name softly, but she never came back. When night fell, he sat by the fire alone for the first time in years. He felt a strange emptiness inside, as if something had been taken that he couldn't name. The next days passed quietly. Daniel worked around the cabin but found no peace. He often walked to the river, hoping to see her standing there. But the banks remained empty. Weeks later, when a passing traveler stopped by the cabin, he found Daniel sitting near the riverbank, eyes closed, resting against a tree. He looked peaceful, like someone who had fallen asleep after a long day. The traveler called his name, but he didn't wake. They buried him near the cabin under the shade of the cottonwood trees. When they looked for signs of the girl, no one could find her. Some said she had gone back to her people. Others believed she had followed the river once more. But there were a few who claimed they saw her on quiet evenings, standing near the river, her long dark hair moving with the wind, watching the water flow. Some said she was guarding it. Others said she was waiting for the man who once saved her and never truly let her go. And on some nights, when the moonlight touched the river, the wind carried a sound that almost felt like her voice. Soft, gentle and endless, whispering across the desert.